Hello and welcome to Section 9 of the Silviculture module. My name is Bob Parker with the Oregon State University Extension Service, and I will be your instructor. In this section we will examine some of the principal methods you can use to thin your forests. In our last section, we took a look at stocking levels or density management concepts, and how you can use published guidelines to be sure your forests are healthy and vigorous. Thinning methods is really a culmination of all the different things we've discussed so far. In a very real sense, thinning your forest appropriately requires a good understanding of forest ecology, how trees and forests grow, and density management, and then applying this information through management actions that will help you achieve your goals and objectives. Our agenda for this section includes what you can manage through thinning, the ecology and biology of thinning, the 4 basic types of thinning, and finally, how to manage the slash that result from thinning. So let's get started. As we mentioned, thinning is just a practical application of your knowledge about forest ecology and biology, selecting the best trees to manage for the long term, and understanding density management or competition stress. The good news is, once you understand the basic concepts, coming up with a good thinning plan is pretty straightforward. Make no mistake, thinning is without a doubt the most important silvicultural practice that you can use to influence the development of your stands to meet both short-term and long-term goals and objectives. Through thinning, you can select which species of trees to keep for the long term. You can also manage for a very uniform, even-aged kind of stand, or the complex crown structure of an uneven-aged system. Thinning allows you to control competition stress and keep the trees healthy and vigorous. And you can selectively remove trees with disease problems to improve the health of the stand. Thinning also reduces the fire fuel loads so that if a wildfire comes through, your forest will have a much better chance of survival. Forest ecology and tree biology were discussed in previous sections, but because thinning is such an important management tool, we'll quickly review a few key points. Thinning allows us to redistribute the limited site resources to just those trees you want to keep for the long term. This keeps your stand growing vigorously. The excellent height growth of this tree is good evidence that it has abundant resources for growth. But in this dense, stagnant stand, the height and diameter growth is very limited due to the high level of competition for resources. Stands in this distressed condition are susceptible to insects and disease problems. And with thinning, you can influence crown development. A wide spacing will lead to longer, wider crowns, while a closely spaced stand will have trees with shorter, narrower crowns. Stands that are not thinned and allowed to stagnate due to high competition stress will have slower diameter growth. Fast-growing trees have better economic potential and may provide desirable wildlife habitat. If wood quality is one of your goals, then you'll want to keep the stand density high enough to avoid long, deep crowns, because this will produce a high proportion of weaker, juvenile wood compared to a tree with a shorter crown, which will have less taper and more mature, structurally superior wood. It's easy to forget about what's going on in the soil, but just as tree branches are competing for sunlight, the roots are competing for water and nutrients. Thinning makes more resources available for the residual trees. If some of your leaf trees are shade-tolerant species, such as grand fir that have been growing under the shade of other trees for some time, a sudden exposure to intense sunlight can cause shock to the tree called sun scald. This may result in damage to the trunk of the tree as shown in the photo. Also, the needles of the tree were adapted to grow in shade, and it will take some time for the tree to transition to sun-adapted needles. This process will increase respiration and cause the tree stress from which it may not recover. Some of the more common reasons for thinning a stand include protecting the stand from insects, disease, and wildfire problems by maintaining the health and vigor of the trees, and reducing the fuel loading. Thin stands may simply be more aesthetically pleasing, and through thinning, stand growth is concentrated on fewer trees, so they are larger and more valuable as merchantable timber. There are many potential variations, but the four main thinning methods we'll discuss are thinning from below, or a low thinning, thinning from above, or a high thinning, which can result in high grading if not careful. A free thinning is a combination of low and high thinnings, varying the techniques to either adapt to changing stand conditions or to meet multiple objectives simultaneously. Pre-commercial thinnings occur when a stand needs to be thinned to maintain growth, but the material is too small to be harvested commercially. In a low thinning, you are closely matching how natural processes would thin the stands through tree mortality. The dominant and co-dominant trees tend to persist, while the suppressed and intermediate crown class trees eventually die out. By thinning the trees yourself, you can more precisely select which trees you want to survive and protect the whole stand from excessive competition stress. Some of the advantages of a low thinning are that it closely mimics natural stand development, so it's easy to understand and apply. The site resources are concentrated on the dominant and co-dominant trees, which have a proven track record of good growth. Biologically, spacing out the trees helps them produce the large crowns needed for good diameter and volume growth, as well as resistance to insect and disease problems. And a low thinning tends to create a uniform appearing, even-aged kind of stand structure. One of the problems with the low thinning is that because you're removing mostly small trees, the logging costs are high and the economic return is rather low. Oftentimes, too few trees are removed, so the stand growth will not meet the landowner's expectations. And uniform stands don't have the structural complexity that favors more diverse wildlife habitats. Another option is called a high thinning, or a thin from above. The goal of a high thinning is to remove a few large trees per acre, and, if done properly, this will help control competition stress and still leave a well-stocked stand of good quality trees. A high thinning definitely has its advantages. For one, because larger, high-value trees are removed, the economic returns are good. It's cheaper to log the big trees, so the logging costs are lower, which also helps economic returns. You can commercially enter a stand earlier, and, from an ecological perspective, a high thinning creates a stand with more canopy layers that may support a greater diversity of wildlife. But the high thinning approach has its disadvantages as well. Since a high thinning removes the bigger trees, it allocates site resources to the lower crown class trees, which may not be able to respond to the additional resources with a high rate of growth until they have enough time to build larger crowns. For a high thinning to work well, only a few big trees should be removed, but if too many big trees are removed, called a high grading, the future stand growth potential may be reduced. And removing the big trees from among the smaller ones can result in damage to the residual trees. Overall, although a high thinning can work well, it requires a high level of skill and knowledge to do it right. A third thinning alternative is called a free thinning. With a free thinning, different thinning techniques are applied to different areas. Site and stand conditions can change quickly as you move over the ground, so you might have to change your strategy in order to manage for the site-specific circumstances. Also, by using a free thinning, you can simultaneously manage for several different management objectives. For example, you could thin from below in one area to create an even-aged stand structure, using optimum spacing for good growth, but in an adjacent area, leave a higher residual stand density, or use a thin from above for wildlife hiding cover and more crown layers. Or if you have an area where the larger crown class trees are infested with mistletoe, remove them and favor smaller trees of a different species that is not susceptible to that particular mistletoe. The thinning methods discussed so far assume the trees are large enough to be economically viable. But sometimes young stands of trees are overstocked and need to be thinned, but the trees are too small to have any economic value. There's no money to be made, and in fact the thinning might be rather expensive, but is still necessary to keep the stand growing vigorously. If pre-commercial thinning is necessary, consider delaying the project until the trees are at least big enough to begin expressing dominance. Then select the dominants and codominants as your leaf trees and remove the excess trees. One of the consequences of pre-commercial thinning is that it tends to create quite a lot of slash, which may represent a very high fire risk. The slash can be treated by piling and burning, lopping and scattering, or crushing, but these treatments can be labor-intensive and expensive. Fire risks are an important consideration, so before conducting any treatment such as thinning, it's always a good idea to talk over your plans with a stewardship forester from the Oregon Department of Forestry, a forestry consultant, or your local OSU Extension forester. How well your trees will respond to a pre-commercial thinning will depend on several different things, such as: were the trees spaced out appropriately? Is there competing understory vegetation? The inherent productivity of the site? The percent of live crown on the residual trees? Are large overstory trees present? And are there any disease problems present in the stand? So, to wrap up our discussion, how do you decide which thinning methods are right for you? As always, start with your goals and objectives. What is it you hope to accomplish? Carefully assess the site capability and stand conditions that you have to work with. It's very important that you understand the dynamics of how trees and forests grow and develop, and the significance of competition stress and density management. These principles are valuable tools that will help you decide which trees are the best trees to leave and how many trees need to be retained for the long term. Through thinning, you can select which species of trees to keep for the long term. You can also manage for a very uniform, even-aged kind of stand, or the complex crown structure of an uneven-aged system. Thinning allows you to control competition stress and keep the trees healthy and vigorous. And you can selectively remove trees with disease problems to improve the health of the stand. Thinning also reduces the fire fuel loads so that if a wildfire comes through, your forest will have a much better chance of survival. In Section 10, we'll introduce other commonly used silvicultural treatments and explain how you can use them to achieve your objectives. These include improvement cuts, sanitation cuts, pruning, and forest fertilization. Thank you for watching this section. I hope you'll enjoy the rest of the program.